Hi guys, and welcome to HTP Storytime. Tonight we will be reading the second chapter from a book called A Casebook for Murder by Colin Wilson. In this chapter, we journey to Elizabethan England in the 1700s, where we see the introduction of a potent and cheap new drink to society called gin. We will also meet one of the most notorious criminals in English history, Dick Turpin. We won't be going too in-depth with his life, but rather his crimes and eventual punishment. We are also introduced to the infamous Gallows at Tyburn, where many a criminal met their maker. Elizabethan England drank beer, wine, sherry, mead, and cider. They drank a lot because the water was not fit to drink unboiled. But although Thomas Dekker wrote in 1632 of a street that was almost a continuous alehouse, or tavern as they were starting to be called, it is doubtful whether these beverages were responsible for much of the crime rate in the first half of the 17th century. To begin with, James I took measures to raise the price of wine from the 4 pence a quart it had cost under Elizabeth, and now the ordinary labourer could only afford to drink beer, and even that had increased in price. Somewhere around 1650 or 1660, a Dutch professor of chemistry called Sylvius discovered that a powerful spirit could be made by distilling the fermentation of juniper berries. This drink was called Geneva, the French word for juniper. It became popular in Holland, and when William of Orange became king in 1689, Geneva began to flow into England in large quantities, and the name was shortened to gin. Gin was cheap and easy to make. The English quickly realized that an even cheaper and stronger spirit could be distilled from low-grade corn, and an Act of Parliament in 1690 allowed anyone to brew and sell spirits without a license, with the consequence that every town in England was suddenly full of gin shops, many of which carried the famous advertisement, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw provided." Beer, wine, and sherry had been too expensive for most labourers, but gin was within the reach of anybody who could earn or beg a penny. Inevitably, the crime rate rose. People in the slums had a great deal they wanted to forget, and 2 pence assured forgetfulness for at least 12 hours. In 1734, a dipsomaniac named Judith Dufour was executed for the murder of her baby. She had collected it from a workhouse where it had been newly clothed and strangled it, throwing the body into a ditch. The clothes sold for a few shillings, which she spent on gin. On the 6th of July 1750, one Elizabethan Banks was hanged at Tyburn for, quote, stripping a child, unquote, no doubt with the same motive. 8 million gallons of gin a year were consumed in England at this time, the consumption in London alone being 14 gallons per head. Within 10 years of the ascension of William and Mary, the crime rate had risen so alarmingly, and crimes of violence carried to a degree of outrageous passion, end quote, were becoming so common that a new law of exceptional savagery was placed on the statute books. This 1699 Act made any theft of goods valued at more than 5 shillings a capital crime. Any kind of shoplifting was a crime, and since the majority of these offenders were women and children, the execution of women and children became commonplace. Hectic. As the number of gin shops increased, at one point one house in every 6 sold gin, so did the neglect and ill treatment of children, and John Fielding, a justice of the peace and half-brother of Henry, spoke of children of 12, quote, half eaten up with the foul distemper, end quote, of the pox. Children were trained to pick pockets, and many of them were hanged for as little as the theft of a handkerchief. The authorities were becoming desperate at this, quote, crime wave, end quote, which would last more than a century, and they reacted in the manner with which we are becoming familiar, by trying to stamp out crime with cruelty. No doubt the Elizabethan mob was as unfeeling as the mob of the 18th century, but the gin made it all the more obvious. Christopher Hibbert said of the period, Pity, quote, "Pity was still a strange and valuable emotion. Unwanted babies were left out in the streets to die, or were thrown into dung heaps or open drains. The torture of animals was a popular sport. Cat dropping, bear baiting, and bull baiting were as universally enjoyed as throwing at cocks." End quote. He goes on, "The Mohawks, a society whose members are dedicated to the ambition of, quote, doing all possible hurt to their fellow creatures," end quote, were mostly gentlemen. They employed their ample leisure in forcing prostitutes and old women to stand on their heads in tar barrels so that they could prick their legs with their swords. I don't know if that's a euphemism. Or in making them jump up and down to avoid the swinging blades. In disfiguring their victims by boring out their eyes or flattening their noses, in waylaying servants, and as in the case of Lady Winchelsea's maid, beating them and slashing their faces. To work themselves up to the necessary pitch of enthusiasm for their ferocious games, they first drank so much that they were, quote, quite beyond the possibility of attending to any notions of reason or humanity, end quote. Some of the Mohawks also seem to have been members of the Bold Bucks, who, apparently, had formally to deny the existence of God and eat every Sunday a dish known as Holy Ghost pie. The ravages of the Bold Bucks were more specifically sexual than those of the Mohawks, and consequently, as it was practically impossible to obtain a conviction for rape, and as the age of consent was 12, they were more openly conducted. Actually, I don't know how much of this is true. I have not Wikipedia'd any of this, so please take this as a pinch of salt from Mr. Colin Wilson in A Casebook of Murder. Okay, he continues. The age had its ideal chronicler in William Hogarth, born in 1697, for he delighted in the portrayal of the sordid and the horrible. Anyone who wants to understand the spirit of the first half of the 18th century should study Plate 7 of his, quote, Industry and Idleness series, showing the idle apprentice in bed with a prostitute. I've looked up this plate. It is a lovely work of art there. He continues, the walls are bare bricks. Oh, he continues describing the picture. Here we go. The walls are bare bricks with a few decaying fragments of plaster. Some of the floor is missing. The bed is simply a sloping plank. There seems to be no window. The room is as cold and dark as a prison cell. The prostitute displayed on the plate, is an ugly, snub-nosed girl with small, firm breasts. To stare at such a picture for 5 minutes is to gain all kinds of insights that the literature of the period cannot convey, because we read it with our own age in mind. One can begin to understand, for example, why the highwaymen of the period became popular heroes. They were hitting back at the system. Modern writers on Dick Turpin take care to point out that he was a brutal scoundrel, whose chief distinction was the manner of his death. He bought new clothes to die in, and hired 5 poor men to walk behind the carter's mourners. He also gave hatbands and gloves to others who would attend his execution, to give it a fashionable touch. Lovely. He joked with the crowd on his way to the scaffold, chatted amiably with the executioner for half an hour, then threw himself off the ladder. He died with style. It was a gesture of defiance at the forces of money and rank that kept the poor in their places, indeed, as if to say, you hold all the cards, but we have more spirit than you. It is true that Turpin's career was not marked by any spectacular bravery or even elegance. When forced to become an outlaw for stealing his neighbor's cattle, he led a gang that simply burst into isolated houses and carried off all the money. If necessary, they tortured the inhabitants, and an occasional servant girl was raped. Yikes. On the run again, Turpin met a highwayman named King, and they became partners. Turpin committed his only murder during this partnership. He shot a man who tried to arrest him. Later still, he shot and killed King, but this seems to have been an accident. He intended to shoot the man who was trying to arrest King. Turpin was now not badly off, and he moved to Lancashire and set up as a gentleman under the name of John Palmer. But horse stealing got him into trouble, and he moved to Weston in Yorkshire. Here he often joined the local gentry in hunting and shooting. One day he shot a cock, and when his companion remonstrated, threatened to shoot him too. Yo. This led to his arrest, and since he did not have the money to put up surety for good behavior, he was committed to prison. He remained there for some time under suspicion of horse stealing. A letter written to his brother finally led to the discovery of his identity. The schoolmaster who had taught him to write recognized the handwriting on the envelope and informed on him. Wow, a little knock here. John Palmer, the suspected horse thief, was discovered to be Dick Turpin, England's public enemy number 1. He was executed on the 7th of April, 1739.